My boyfriend's best friend gave him a handmade gift right after I told her I was making one for him too. Now I feel awkward giving mine and don't know how to handle it without seeming petty or territorial. I, 39 female, met my boyfriend, Tim, 49 male, about 4 months ago, and I can honestly say it's been one of the most emotionally fulfilling relationships I've experienced. From our very first date, there was an ease about him that made me feel safe and seen. He had a quiet confidence, a sharp sense of humor, and this rare emotional openness that made me feel like I didn't have to guess what he was thinking. He was present, attentive, supportive in a way that didn't feel performative. It just felt like who he was. Tim made it clear early on that he wasn't just a partner in the romantic sense, he was also deeply connected to the people in his life. He had a strong, wide circle of friends, actual friends, not just casual acquaintances. Over time, I met many of them, and the thing I noticed almost immediately was how loved he was. These people knew him, respected him, and it was obvious that he had earned that kind of loyalty. He showed up for his people, and they showed up for him. Among that group was a woman named Debbie, around 45, who had been in his life for 4 or 5 years. Before I even met her, Tim gave me some context about their relationship. He mentioned, gently, that there might have been some unrequited feelings from her side in the past. He said it without drama or defensiveness, just a thoughtful explanation. He also mentioned that Debbie was socially a little awkward and that she didn't have a large support network. According to him, they had never been romantically involved, but they were close. She was one of his day ones, as he put it. She watched his dog when he traveled, texted him memes daily, and leaned on him in a very natural, comfortable way. He reassured me that nothing about their friendship crossed any emotional or physical boundaries. And truthfully, from everything I saw, that was true. Their interactions were respectful, casual, familiar. She wasn't flirtatious or suggestive. Her messages were mostly silly inside jokes or check-ins. I never felt threatened or uneasy. If anything, I admired that Tim had people like that in his corner, people who could count on him and whom he could count on too. They also did practical favors for each other, the kind of things close friends naturally do. He'd help her with 2-person house projects, pick her up from the airport, that sort of thing. These days, those kinds of things had started shifting toward me. He called me when he needed help or company, but Debbie still reached out to him sometimes, and I didn't see anything wrong with that. It was part of a life he had before me, and it wasn't something I felt entitled to erase or control. The first time I met her was over lunch. Tim and I were out at a bar near our place on a weekend afternoon, and Debbie joined us. She had just received some good news about her job, a promotion or a new contract. I can't remember the exact title, and she was clearly in high spirits. She was excited to tell Tim all about it. From the moment she arrived, she launched into the story, and most of the lunch revolved around that. Now, I'm someone who understands that friendships have their own rhythms, and I wasn't expecting to be the center of attention. But I will admit, I felt like a bit of an outsider during that lunch. Tim made a visible effort to include me. He turned to me and asked, "Didn't you go through something similar at your last job?" Or, "Babe, what would you have done in that situation?" Little nudges to bring me into the fold. But Debbie never really picked up on it. She didn't respond directly to anything I said, and she didn't ask me any questions. It wasn't overt rudeness, more like I wasn't even there. The second time I met Debbie was at a small gathering Tim hosted at his house. It was just 4 of us, Tim, Debbie, another couple, and me. I was honestly looking forward to it. Our first meeting had been brief and a little underwhelming. She had just received good news about work and had been mostly engaged in conversation with Tim. I didn't take it personally, we'd just met, but I was hoping this second interaction would be a chance to actually connect with her, even a little. When she arrived, though, something felt off from the moment she stepped through the door. She walked in, paused, and suddenly said, "I've had a really bad day. I don't want to be around people." And then she just stood there. For a second, it looked like she might leave. The timing of it made me feel awkward, like maybe seeing me there was what set her off. I don't know for sure, but it felt like my presence triggered something. I instantly felt this tug of guilt, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. I reminded myself that she was close to Tim and probably dealing with some personal stuff, but the tension in the air was palpable. Tim tried to ease the moment. He gently encouraged her to stay and said something like, "Come in. It might help you feel better." I didn't want her to feel ganged up on or pressured, but I stepped in too and kindly invited her to have a drink and just hang out with us, no pressure. She paused for a moment, then agreed and came in, but she definitely wasn't at ease. We all gathered in the living room, chatting and settling into the cozy atmosphere Tim had set up. But Debbie didn't join us there. Instead, She hovered in the dining area, which is technically open to the living room but emotionally felt like a wall. She stood or sat off to the side, separate from the group. I noticed it immediately and tried not to take it personally. I even made a conscious effort not to sit right next to Tim, thinking maybe if I kept things low pressure, she'd feel more welcome. But she remained distant. The other two guests and I made light conversation, and Tim tried a few times to include Debbie. He gently invited her to sit with us, and eventually, after a good 10 or 15 minutes, she moved into the living room. But instead of taking a seat on one of the couches like everyone else, she sat on the floor, slightly apart. Trying again to extend a gesture of kindness, I brought her a drink. I walked over, squatted down beside her to offer it, and said something like, "I'm really sorry you're having a rough day. I know we don't know each other well, but I'm here if you ever want to talk." Her reaction completely caught me off guard. She looked at me sharply, and with 2 fingers, jabbed me in the shoulder, not playfully, not lightly. It wasn't aggressive enough to be physically painful, but it was intentional. Then she said in a curt tone, "I don't know you like that, so no, I'm not going to talk to you." There was no mistaking the message. I felt stunned, not just because of her words, but because she had actually touched me in a way that felt hostile. I stayed quiet, nodded, and said, "Okay." Then I stood up and walked away, feeling awkward, embarrassed, and honestly done. I went and sat next to Tim. At that point, I figured I'd tried. I'd offered kindness, patience, and respect. And what I got back was dismissal. A few minutes later, Debbie left. That night, once everyone had gone, Tim and I had a real conversation about what happened. I was still processing it. I told him I felt uncomfortable with how she spoke to me, and especially with the physical touch. He didn't try to defend her or brush it off. He looked genuinely upset that the night had gone that way, and even offered, without hesitation, to step back from her or cut her off completely if I felt it was necessary for my comfort. That meant a lot. We were still fairly new, just a few months in, but it showed me that my boundaries mattered to him. That he wasn't going to play neutral just because someone had been in his life longer. But I told him I didn't want to make that call immediately. I said that in any new relationship, romantic or platonic, people deserve at least one free pass. One bad day, one moment of weirdness, one situation where they don't show up as their best self. I said I understood she might be struggling. She clearly seemed like someone who didn't have many close relationships, and maybe she just didn't know how to navigate new dynamics. That said, I was clear. Her behavior was not okay. Since that awkward night at Tim's, I've seen Debbie 2 more times, and I have to admit, both times were much more pleasant. She was friendly, made small talk, even smiled more than I'd seen her do before. Still socially awkward, yes, but in a way that just felt like someone who doesn't always know how to ease into conversations, not someone trying to be hostile or cold. I appreciated the effort, and tried to meet her halfway. The last time I saw her was about a month ago. We ended up talking for a bit longer than usual, nothing deep, but we touched on hobbies and interests. She mentioned that she'd always wanted to learn how to crochet, which caught my attention immediately. I've been crocheting since I was a kid. It's something I genuinely love, and I always enjoy helping people learn. So I smiled and said I'd be happy to show her sometime if she wanted. She seemed interested. She asked if I was working on anything at the moment, and without really thinking twice, I shared that I was crocheting a blanket for Tim. I told her how he had once mentioned that no one had ever made him something before, like, ever, and that this blanket felt special to me. I was really excited to give it to him. It wasn't about the yarn or the hours I was putting in, it was about making something with my own hands that I knew would mean something to him. He's been such a supportive partner, and it felt good to be creating something personal for someone I care deeply about. Debbie smiled when I told her, and the conversation moved on. I thought nothing more of it. That brings me to what happened today. Tim and I were spending a quiet Sunday morning together at his place. Nothing fancy, just coffee, music, and that lovely stillness that comes from being comfortable around someone. I was sitting on the couch, working on that same blanket, in fact, when there was a knock at the door. I got up to answer it. It was Debbie. She smiled at me and said, "I have a surprise for Tim." She was clearly excited, more animated than I'd usually seen her. At first, I thought maybe it was something funny or quirky. Before I could even call for Tim, she pulled out the surprise, a crocheted blanket. For him. My heart dropped for a second. I don't even know how to explain the feeling. It wasn't just the blanket, it was the timing, the intent, the complete disregard for the context we had shared. To be clear, it wasn't a throw blanket or a full-sized one you could curl up under on the couch. It was baby blanket-sized. Way too small for a grown man to use for anything. Decorative, maybe. But honestly, it felt rushed, like it had been made quickly, just enough to technically count as a gift. And the thing is, she knew. She knew I was making him a blanket. She knew why it mattered to me. I had shared that with her in what I thought was a friendly, generous moment. So to show up unannounced with a last-minute blanket for him, it didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt calculated. Tim didn't even know she was coming. Later, I saw that she had texted him about 15 minutes before she arrived, saying she had a surprise for him. He hadn't seen the message until after she was already at the door. So it wasn't planned, or mutual, or even particularly thoughtful. It was just odd. Tim thanked her politely, of course. He's kind to everyone. But I could tell even he was a little confused by the gesture and the blanket itself. I stayed calm and said nothing in the moment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was less about the gift and more about sending a message. I'm not someone who usually gets caught up in petty dynamics, but this felt different. It wasn't about jealousy or competition. It was about intention. I had let her into a moment that was personal for me, and instead of connecting through that, she used it to one-up me, or at least to try. It's left me feeling unsettled. Not threatened, not insecure, just disappointed. Because I had genuinely tried to be kind to her, to include her, to build a foundation of mutual respect. And this felt like a subtle but pointed dismissal of that effort. I haven't decided how I'll handle it going forward. I'll likely take a step back, quietly. I'm not going to make this a drama or bring tension into Tim's life. But I'm also not going to keep offering warmth to someone who keeps responding with cold games. At one point, while she was showing the blanket to Tim, he turned to her with a genuinely surprised smile and said, "I didn't know that was in your skill repertoire. How long have you been crocheting?" She laughed a little and said, "Oh, I just started. This is only the second thing I've ever made. The first one was terrible." I sat silently, watching their interaction with a strange feeling brewing in my chest. It wasn't jealousy, but something more complicated, like watching someone walk across a bridge you built and pretend it had always been there. As they talked more about crocheting, Debbie launched into this rambling comment about how once you start crocheting, you end up with too much crocheted stuff lying around the house, and eventually have to start gifting it to people. Which, by the way, was almost verbatim something I had said to her when we'd spoken a few weeks ago. It was something I shared casually in that friendly moment when I told her about making Tim's blanket, the very project that clearly had inspired hers. But hearing it now, recycled back to me like it had originated from her own experience, felt oddly performative. Especially considering she'd just said this was only her second crochet project. If that were true, she couldn't possibly have piles of yarn crafts cluttering her home. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she delivered them, like she was deliberately sliding into a role she thought she needed to play to claim space in Tim's world. And as small as the gesture might seem to an outsider, it stung. Because this wasn't really about a blanket. It was about something deeper. Intimacy, thoughtfulness, creativity, and the quiet but meaningful way I had hoped to offer that to Tim. Now, I feel stuck. I've been working on this blanket for weeks. Every stitch carries intention. I've spent evenings curled up with yarn in my lap, imagining how happy he might be when he received it, how comforted, how seen. I wasn't trying to compete with anyone. I just wanted to give something heartfelt to someone who makes me feel truly loved. But now, if I give it to him, will it seem like I'm reacting to her gesture? Will it come across as one-upping her? Or worse, will it seem like I'm insecure or territorial about my place in his life? That's the part I'm really struggling with. I know Tim would never see it that way, not consciously. He's not someone who plays into petty dramas. But people have subconscious narratives all the time, and I can't help but worry that something that once felt so purely loving is now tangled up in this invisible tension between Debbie and me. I haven't said anything to him about how I'm feeling yet. I've been sitting with it. Partly because I don't want to create drama where there doesn't need to be any, but also because I'm trying to sort through what I actually feel versus what this moment is triggering in me. The truth is, I don't want to compete with her. I don't want to feel like I have to guard every kind gesture or personal detail I share. But this small, seemingly harmless act, her showing up with a blanket right after I told her about mine, felt like an encroachment, not a coincidence. And now I'm at a crossroads. Do I let this shift my energy and shrink myself? Or do I reclaim the space I was already holding before this even happened? At the end of the day, I think I have to remind myself of why I started making the blanket in the first place. It wasn't for recognition. It wasn't to impress anyone. It certainly wasn't to outdo a friend. It was because I care about Tim, because he's brought warmth into my life, and this was my way of bringing some back into his. So I've decided I'm still going to give it to him. But when I do, I'm going to be honest, not in a dramatic, accusatory way, but in a way that honors my own feelings. I'll tell him I started making it weeks ago because I wanted to do something personal for him. That I mentioned it to Debbie when she and I were chatting about hobbies. And that while I was caught off guard when she gave him one too, I realized it would be a mistake to let someone else's actions diminish something I created with care. Because at the end of the day, I want to live in a relationship where we can talk about uncomfortable feelings with maturity, not tiptoe around them in fear of appearing too much. Any kind of advice would be appreciated.